The courtroom erupted in cheers, a celebration of injustice disguised as law. The officers in their pressed uniforms, smug and triumphant, clapped each other on the back as if they had just won a championship game. The judge, seated high above, his gavel still warm from delivering the crushing verdict, leaned back in his chair with a satisfied smirk. A woman, a black woman, stood before them, her wrists in cold steel cuffs, her dignity stripped in front of an audience that had already decided her fate long before the trial even began. She had been framed. The drugs found in her car were planted, the so-called witnesses coached, the evidence against her carefully constructed like an elaborate stage play. They had orchestrated everything, and now they were relishing in their victory. The officers, the judge, the prosecution, everyone involved knew the truth. But the truth didn't matter. The system wasn't designed to serve her, and they wanted to make an example out of her. One of the officers, the ringleader of this injustice, stepped forward, his boots echoing on the marble floor. He leaned in close, so only she could hear, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Bet you thought you were untouchable, huh? Look at you now. Just another statistic." The courtroom burst into laughter. She felt their eyes on her, stripping away her humanity, reducing her to nothing more than a spectacle for their amusement. She had spent her entire life fighting for justice, for truth, for integrity, only to be standing here, shackled, humiliated, her voice stolen by the very system she had dedicated her life to upholding. The judge adjusted his robe, clearing his throat dramatically before speaking. "This court finds the defendant guilty on all charges," he announced, his voice calm, almost lazy, as if the decision had been made long before the trial even began. "Sentencing will be immediate. We recommend the maximum penalty under federal law." The officers grinned. One of them turned to the defense attorney, a man who had barely spoken throughout the trial, who had let her be railroaded without so much as a fight. "Good job, counselor," the officer sneered. "Way to put up a real fight." More laughter. More humiliation. She stood motionless, the weight of injustice pressing down on her chest like an iron grip. They thought they had won. They thought they had stripped her of everything, her reputation, her freedom, her very identity. They had no idea who they were dealing with. A slow breath. A flicker of something in her eyes, something that none of them noticed because they were too busy celebrating their corruption. She tilted her head slightly, her voice low but firm. "You should be careful about the way you celebrate," she said, her tone carrying an edge that sent a slight ripple through the room. "Because in a few moments, none of you will be laughing." A hush fell over the courtroom. The officers exchanged confused glances. The judge narrowed his eyes. The lead officer chuckled, stepping closer, his amusement still evident. "Oh yeah? And why's that?" She straightened her shoulders, a glint of steel in her eyes, her presence suddenly shifting, no longer the victim, no longer the accused, but something else. "Because," she said, her voice calm, deliberate. "I am the director of the FBI." Silence. The air in the courtroom changed instantly. The smirks faded. The judge's fingers twitched slightly on his gavel. The lead officer's breath caught in his throat, his confidence crumbling in real time. The celebration turned to shock, the laughter into a stunned, disbelieving hush. One of the officers muttered, "No. That's not possible." But deep down, they all knew it was. And then the doors burst open. Federal agents poured into the courtroom like a tidal wave, their presence overwhelming, their movements precise. Guns drawn, voices sharp with authority. Hands where we can see them. The officers who had been so proud, so arrogant, suddenly paled. The judge, who had moments ago been reveling in his power, reached for his gavel, as if the weight of it could somehow shield him from what was coming. But there was no escape. The corruption had run deep for years, a network of lies and abuses that had destroyed countless lives. But now, the tables had turned. The hunted had become the hunter. One by one, they were cuffed. The same cold steel that had once bound her wrists now locked around theirs. Their expressions were priceless: shock, disbelief, the creeping realization that everything they had done, everything they had built on lies and injustice, had finally come crashing down. And as she stood there, no longer the victim of their system but the one dismantling it from within, she allowed herself a single, quiet smile. Because justice had finally arrived. But the real question is, what happens when the system itself is built to protect the corrupt? And what will she have to do to make sure they all pay? Before we dive into this powerful story, we want to take a moment to speak directly to our Black audience. At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against racism, discrimination, and injustice in any form. This channel is a space where stories reflect the truth, expose corruption, and highlight resilience. If you've ever faced unfair treatment or felt unheard, know that your voice matters, your story matters, and justice is always worth fighting for. Now, get ready for a thrilling and emotional ride. If you enjoy these powerful stories, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. Let's jump into it. Baton Rouge, Louisiana, was a city that carried the weight of its history in the air like the thick humidity that clung to its streets. It was a place where the past bled into the present, where grand courthouses and government buildings stood as monuments to a justice system that had never truly been just. The city's skyline gleamed with modern high-rises and corporate offices, but beneath that polished exterior was a reality that people like Jordan Carter had known their entire lives. The divide was deep, unspoken yet undeniable, a fracture between those who wielded power and those who suffered beneath it. The law was supposed to be blind, but in Baton Rouge, it saw everything: skin color, bank accounts, family names, and it made its decisions accordingly. Jordan had grown up on the north side of the city, in a neighborhood where opportunity was scarce, but resilience was abundant. Her mother, Angela Carter, had worked herself to exhaustion, holding down 2 jobs just to keep food on the table, all while reminding her daughter that the world was not fair, that the rules were not made to protect people like them. But she had also instilled in Jordan an unshakable determination, a refusal to accept defeat, a belief that no matter how the deck was stacked, she could rise above it. That belief had driven Jordan to push herself beyond the limits, to excel in school when the system expected her to fail, to carve a path into law enforcement when statistics said she would never make it. She had fought her way through college, through the grueling training at Quantico, through the endless obstacles that came with being a black woman in a field dominated by men who saw her as either a token or a threat. She had learned to navigate it all, had built a reputation as someone who never backed down, never folded under pressure, never allowed corruption to go unchallenged. Her rise through the ranks of the FBI had been swift, earned through relentless dedication and an unyielding pursuit of justice. She had exposed dirty cops, taken down criminal enterprises, and dismantled entire networks of corruption. Her work had made her both respected and feared, a name that carried weight in rooms where people thought they were untouchable. But Baton Rouge was different. The corruption here was not just a series of bad apples, it was an entire system designed to protect itself. The police, the courts, the politicians, they were all tied together, a web of power and influence that crushed anyone who dared to challenge it. And at the center of it all was Judge Randall Greaves. Greaves was a man who had spent more than 2 decades wielding his gavel like a weapon, deciding fates with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He was the kind of man who gave speeches about law and order while cutting backroom deals that ensured justice was reserved for the highest bidder. He had the city in his pocket, from the police force to the district attorney's office, a network of loyalty built on greed and silence. His rulings had condemned innocent men and women to prison while allowing murderers, drug traffickers, and corporate criminals to walk free. And he had done it all with the full confidence that no one would ever hold him accountable. Beneath him were the enforcers, the officers who carried out his will without question. Sergeant Kyle Mercer was the muscle, a towering presence with a reputation for excessive force and a fondness for brutality. He ruled his precinct like a king, demanding loyalty from his subordinates and instilling fear in anyone who dared cross him. Officer Tony Reyes was the opportunist, the one who smiled as he planted evidence, who laughed as he signed false reports, who knew how to work the system in his favor. Detective Brandon Cole was the quiet one, the cleaner, the man who erased body cam footage, who manipulated case files, who made sure everything looked legitimate on paper even when it was anything but. Together, they were untouchable, a force that had terrorized the city for years, crushing lives, silencing voices, and ensuring that the machine of corruption continued to turn without interruption. When Jordan started investigating them, she knew she was stepping into dangerous territory. She had seen officers like them before, men who thought their badges made them invincible, who believed the law existed to serve them rather than the people. But this time, it was different. This time, they weren't just bad cops abusing their power, they were an organized unit, a syndicate operating under the protection of the very institutions meant to stop them. The deeper she dug, the clearer it became that this wasn't just a case of police misconduct, this was a full-scale criminal enterprise operating under the guise of law enforcement. They saw her coming. They knew she was getting too close. So they did what they had always done to threats, they eliminated her. The setup was flawless. A routine traffic stop, a search that was anything but random, the drugs planted with precision, the arrest carried out with the kind of cold efficiency that came from years of practice. The charges were severe, possession with intent to distribute, a felony that carried a mandatory sentence. The media was fed a narrative before she even had a chance to defend herself. A decorated FBI agent caught in a drug bust, a disgrace to law enforcement, a shocking betrayal of the badge. The trial was a formality, a spectacle orchestrated to cement her downfall. The judge played his role to perfection, his ruling swift and merciless. The prosecution painted her as a criminal mastermind, while the defense attorney, an uninterested public defender who had been assigned to her case, offered only the bare minimum of resistance. The evidence was overwhelming because it had been designed to be. The witnesses had been coached, their statements rehearsed. And so, the verdict came down. Guilty on all charges. Maximum sentence recommended. The courtroom erupted in celebration, as if justice had been served. The officers grinned, exchanging handshakes and pats on the back, their laughter ringing through the air. The judge leaned back in his chair, satisfied, pleased with himself for having orchestrated yet another perfect execution of his brand of justice. Jordan stood in the center of it all, shackled, humiliated, forced to endure the mockery of the very people who had orchestrated her downfall. Sergeant Mercer leaned in, his voice low, laced with mock sympathy as he whispered in her ear, savoring every word. Bet you thought you were untouchable, huh? Look at you now. Just another statistic. Laughter echoed through the room. Smug, triumphant, filled with the certainty that they had won, that they had broken her, that she would disappear into the system like so many before her. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated her. They thought they had taken everything from her, stripped her of her power, erased her influence. But Jordan Carter was not just another victim. She was not someone who folded under pressure, who accepted injustice, who let corruption win. They had framed her, humiliated her, sentenced her. But they had no idea what was coming next. Because Jordan Carter was not just an FBI agent. She was the director. The air inside the courthouse was suffocating, thick with the smug arrogance of men who believed they had already won. The officers lounged at their seats, their badges gleaming under the artificial light, their grins sharp like knives. The judge sat high above, adjusting his robe with slow, deliberate movements, as if savoring the weight of his power. The prosecution, led by a man whose career had been built on show trials and political favors, flipped through his papers without urgency. The verdict had been decided long before Jordan Carter ever stepped into the courtroom. This was not a trial. This was a public execution of her career, her reputation, her life. Mercer sat near the prosecution, leaning back in his chair, his expression one of absolute victory. His uniform was crisp, polished, his boots shining like he had been preparing for this moment. Reyes whispered something to Cole, both of them chuckling under their breath, barely able to contain their amusement. This was entertainment to them, a game they had rigged so well they didn't even need to pretend anymore. Their laughter cut through the silence, sending a wave of quiet humiliation rippling through Jordan's chest. They thought she was finished. They thought this was over. The judge cleared his throat, tapping his gavel lightly against the wood, more of a formality than a necessity. He barely glanced at Jordan before speaking, his voice smooth, practiced, dripping with false authority. "Miss Carter, the court finds you guilty on all charges. Given the severity of your offenses and the irrefutable evidence presented before this court, I see no reason to delay sentencing. The law is clear. Your actions warrant the maximum penalty." His lips curled into something almost resembling a smile. "May this serve as a reminder that no one is above the law." Laughter rippled through the courtroom again, quiet but unmistakable. Jordan remained still, her spine straight, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She could feel every pair of eyes on her, waiting for her reaction, for a flicker of desperation, for any sign that she was broken. She gave them nothing. Mercer exhaled sharply, shaking his head with mock disappointment. "Damn shame. Thought you were smarter than this, Carter. Thought you'd know better than to go digging where you didn't belong." He leaned forward, voice dropping just enough so only she could hear. "You really thought you were gonna take us down? You thought you had power? Look at you now." Reyes chuckled beside him, nudging Cole. "I'll bet she thought she was some kind of hero. Thought she was gonna clean up the city, huh?" His grin widened. "Bet it burns, knowing you lost." Jordan inhaled slowly, steadying herself against the flood of rage threatening to rise to the surface. Every word, every taunt, every smirk, it was designed to break her. To remind her that in their world, power wasn't earned through justice or integrity. It was taken, stolen, bought with silence and complicity. The judge rapped his gavel once more, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "Bailiff, remove the defendant from my courtroom." The chains around her wrists rattled as she turned toward the doors. She caught Mercer's eyes one last time, saw the certainty there, the absolute belief that this was the last time she would ever stand in a place of power, that she was walking toward the end. He was wrong. She let a slow smile pull at the corner of her lips. Not a grin, not the cocky bravado he expected, but something quieter. Something that made his smirk falter for just a second. That was all she needed. 1 second of doubt. As she was led out of the courtroom, Reyes frowned, shifting in his seat. The hell was that? Cole glanced toward Mercer. She smiled. Why the hell would she be smiling? Mercer exhaled sharply, shaking off the unease. She's trying to act tough. It doesn't matter. But even as he said it, his jaw tightened just slightly. Jordan was taken into the holding area beneath the courthouse, a cold, sterile room lined with metal benches and bolted-down chairs. The guards barely looked at her. To them, she was just another case, another prisoner waiting for transfer. They had no idea. None of them did. She sat, back straight, eyes sharp, breathing even. A guard finally spoke, tossing a file onto the table in front of her. Your lawyer will be in soon. Not that it'll do you any good. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. The clock ticked on the wall. 1 minute. 2. Then, the door opened. It wasn't her lawyer who entered. It was an agent. Her agent. He shut the door behind him, his posture too stiff, his fingers twitching slightly. He kept his voice low. It's done. Jordan nodded once, slowly. Another pause. Then, the agent exhaled. Are you sure you want to do this? She met his eyes. They think they've won. Let them believe it. A moment passed, heavy with unspoken words. Then, the agent placed a small device onto the table, pressed a button, and the screen flickered to life. Live feed. The courtroom. The judge. The officers. All of them. Jordan's lips parted, barely above a whisper. Start recording. The agent nodded. The camera zoomed in. Upstairs, Mercer was laughing. Reyes was bragging. Cole was relaxed in his seat, stretching his arms, muttering something about how easy it had all been. Jordan Carter sat in the cold, metal room beneath them, chains still around her wrists, but it didn't matter. Because they had no idea what was about to happen next. The courtroom had settled into a steady hum of low conversations and murmured laughter. Mercer leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming against the polished wooden table, his smirk lingering as if he could still taste victory. Reyes was stretching, cracking his knuckles, his posture loose with satisfaction. Cole was scrolling through his phone, his usual quiet indifference unchanged, but even he looked pleased. The judge had retired to his chambers for a moment, leaving the officers and attorneys to bask in their triumph. The verdict had been delivered, the sentencing inevitable, and now all that was left was to let the system do its job. They had done what they always did, take someone down, bury them under false charges, and move on like nothing ever happened. Then the doors opened. It wasn't the bailiff. It wasn't another courtroom clerk coming in with paperwork. It was a team of agents, federal agents, moving in with precision, their presence cutting through the air like a blade. Their suits were sharp, their expressions unreadable, their movements efficient. It took half a second for Mercer's smirk to fade, for Reyes to freeze mid-stretch, for Cole to lower his phone. A quiet, sharp tension slid into the room like an invisible force. At the center of the formation, walking with the kind of authority that did not ask for respect but demanded it, was Jordan Carter. No chains. No escort. No helplessness. She wasn't the accused anymore. She was in control. Mercer's chair scraped against the floor as he stood, his body tensing. What the hell is this? Jordan didn't answer immediately. She let the silence stretch, let them feel the shift in power. Her eyes swept the room, taking in every detail, every flicker of confusion, every breath that hitched in their throats. Then she stepped forward, slowly, purposefully, and when she spoke, her voice was measured, calm, devastatingly lethal. You made a mistake. Reyes let out a sharp laugh, but there was a nervous edge to it now. Oh yeah? And what's that? Jordan tilted her head slightly. You thought this was real. Cole frowned. What? This trial. This setup. This entire performance. Her eyes locked onto Mercer's. You thought you had control. A ripple of unease passed between them. Mercer glanced at the agents, at their unreadable expressions, at the tension coiling tighter with every second. His hands curled into fists at his sides. I don't know what game you're playing, he said, voice lower now, laced with a warning he no longer had the power to enforce. Jordan took another step forward, closing the distance between them. She wasn't afraid. She never had been. Oh, this isn't a game, she said, her voice quieter now, more cutting. It's a trap. Cole's eyes narrowed. What are you talking about? Jordan reached into her jacket pocket, pulling out a sleek black remote, her thumb hovering over the button. You really should have been paying attention. She pressed it. The screens in the courtroom flickered. The large monitor usually used for evidence displays now lit up, the audio kicking in a second later. And then, as the feed began playing, everything changed. It was them. Mercer. Reyes. Cole. Every conversation. Every meeting. Every whispered command to plant evidence. Every edited body cam footage. Every crime they had committed while thinking they were untouchable. And it wasn't just video. It was audio recordings of them laughing about cases they had fabricated. It was text messages, emails, bank statements linking them to money funneled in from organized crime. It was evidence so damning that no one in this room could pretend not to see it. The sound of Reyes' own voice filled the room. Who gives a damn if she's innocent? She's a problem, and problems get handled. Then Mercer's voice. Greaves already signed off. Just make sure the files are buried. We're doing the city a favor. Then the judge himself. As long as my cut stays the same, I don't care what you do. Just don't get sloppy. The air turned to ice. Judge Greaves, who had just returned from his chambers, stopped in his tracks. His face drained of color as his own voice echoed through the courtroom, exposing him, shredding his authority, turning him into nothing more than another corrupt man caught in his own web. For a moment, no one moved. Then Mercer lunged. Or at least, he tried to. Before he could take a single step, he was met with the barrel of an FBI agent's gun, the agent's voice steady and unshaken. Don't. Mercer's breath was coming hard now, his shoulders rising and falling as his entire world collapsed around him. Reyes' mouth opened and closed, his skin pale, his usual arrogance nowhere to be found. Cole was already looking at the exits, but there was nowhere to run. Jordan took a slow, measured step closer to Mercer. You thought you had all the power. Her voice was even, controlled, merciless. You thought you could ruin me, like you ruined so many others. You thought this city belonged to you. She let the weight of it settle before she leaned in just slightly, lowering her voice. You never saw me coming. Mercer's jaw clenched so hard a vein pulsed at his temple. You think this changes anything? He let out a short, humorless laugh, but his voice wasn't steady anymore. You think you've won? Jordan didn't blink. I don't think. She gestured around the room. I know. As if on cue, the doors to the courtroom burst open again, and more federal agents flooded in. This time, they weren't just there for show. They were here for arrests. Randall Greaves, an agent announced, stepping toward the judge. You are under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, bribery, and misconduct in office. The gavel slipped from the judge's fingers, hitting the ground with a hollow thud. His lips parted, but no words came out. The agent turned toward Mercer, Reyes, and Cole. Sergeant Kyle Mercer, Officer Tony Reyes, Detective Brandon Cole. He began listing their charges, but by the time he was halfway through, Reyes was already shaking his head, hands raised as if surrendering would somehow save him. Mercer was the last to move. Even as the agent stepped toward him, even as the reality of his downfall settled in, he refused to lower his head. But Jordan saw it. She saw the fear. The handcuffs clicked around his wrists. This time, he was the one being shackled. The agents began leading them away, one by one, stripping them of their badges, their weapons, everything they had once used to hurt others. Jordan didn't move. She just stood there, watching as justice finally caught up with them. And then, as Mercer was dragged past her, she met his eyes one last time. No words were exchanged. They weren't needed. Because she had already won. The air in the courtroom had changed, thickening with something unspoken, something raw and irreversible. The weight of justice, true justice, not the version these men had twisted and abused, was finally settling in. The walls that had once protected them, that had made them feel untouchable, were crumbling. Every smirk, every moment of arrogance, every injustice they had committed was now crashing down upon them. And Jordan Carter was standing right there to watch it happen. Mercer's breathing had turned shallow, his hands clenched so tightly into fists that his knuckles had gone white, but it didn't matter. The cuffs were locked around his wrists, and this time, there was no escape. Reyes had gone eerily quiet, his usual cocky bravado extinguished, his eyes darting between the agents, looking for some way out that didn't exist. Cole was staring at the floor, his jaw tight, his mind already spinning, calculating, realizing that no amount of forged paperwork, no manipulated evidence could save him now. Judge Greaves still hadn't moved. He was standing behind his bench, his face devoid of all color, his lips slightly parted like he was struggling to understand the reality before him. He had spent decades playing God in this courtroom, deciding the fates of others with a flick of his gavel, handing down rulings like a king atop his throne. And yet, in this moment, he was nothing. Just a man drowning in the consequences of his own corruption. Jordan didn't take her eyes off Mercer as she stepped forward, closing the space between them, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She didn't speak immediately. She let the silence stretch, let him feel the inevitability of what was happening, let the tension wrap around his throat like a noose. She could see it in his eyes, the fight still there, buried under the panic, the disbelief. Men like him didn't believe they could lose. They spent their whole lives convincing themselves that the rules were different for them, that power meant immunity. You were always so sure, weren't you? Her voice was calm, deliberate, a blade slicing through the quiet. So sure that you could take anyone down, bury the truth, rewrite reality however you saw fit. Mercer's jaw twitched, his breathing still ragged. He wanted to lunge at her, she could see it, feel it in the way his muscles tensed, but the cuffs on his wrists, the agents surrounding him, the weight of his downfall, it kept him frozen in place. He swallowed hard, forcing his voice steady. You think this makes you better than me? Jordan let out a quiet breath, a laugh without humor. Better? She tilted her head slightly. That's the thing, Mercer. I never needed to be better than you. You were never as powerful as you thought you were. Reyes shifted beside him, shaking his head, his voice cutting through the room. This is bullshit, he spat, his breath uneven. You think you're some kind of hero? You think any of this is gonna change how things work? He exhaled sharply, his hands shaking slightly as he glared at her. This city doesn't change. People like us, we don't lose. Jordan's expression remained unreadable. Look around, Reyes. She gestured to the agents, to the monitors still displaying the damning evidence, to the courtroom that had become a tomb for their careers, their reputations, their freedom. You already lost. Cole finally looked up, his face pale, his lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. How long? His voice was quieter than the others, more controlled, but there was an edge of something else there. Not defiance. Not anger. Resignation. He met Jordan's eyes, the weight of the truth finally settling on his shoulders. How long have you been setting this up? Jordan held his gaze, watching as the last remnants of whatever false hope he had been clinging to dissolved. Long enough. Mercer let out a sharp breath, shaking his head like he could somehow will away the reality of the situation. You think they'll let you get away with this? His voice was lower now, a last-ditch effort to hold on to control. You think the system won't eat you alive, just like it does everyone else? Jordan's expression didn't change, but there was something steely in the way she held herself, something unwavering. You don't get it, do you? She took another step closer, standing just inches away from him now, lowering her voice so that when she spoke, only he could hear. You and I are not the same. You built your power on fear. On silence. On the belief that no one would ever have the courage to challenge you. She let the words settle before she leaned in slightly, her breath barely above a whisper. I built mine on the truth. And the truth always wins. For the first time, Mercer had no response. Judge Greaves cleared his throat, attempting to salvage whatever pathetic shred of authority he thought he still had. His voice came out weaker than before, strained, the weight of the evidence crushing him. This is highly irregular. He lifted his chin, grasping at whatever scraps of dignity remained. You don't have the authority to. Jordan turned, meeting his eyes, cutting him off before he could finish. Judge Randall Greaves, you are under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and judicial misconduct. The words landed like a blow, knocking the air from his lungs. His own courtroom. His own rules. Used against him. He stumbled slightly, gripping the edge of his bench as if he could anchor himself to the past, to a time when he had been the one delivering sentences instead of receiving them. The lead agent stepped forward, removing a pair of cuffs from his belt. "Hands where we can see them." Greaves blinked rapidly, his mind struggling to process a world where he was not the highest authority in the room. His fingers twitched, but there was nowhere to run. Slowly, his hands lifted, trembling slightly, and the cuffs snapped around his wrists. Jordan watched as they led him past her, his eyes darting to hers, a final flicker of desperation, a plea for mercy that he had never shown anyone else. She said nothing. Because men like him didn't deserve mercy. As Greaves disappeared through the doors, Jordan turned back toward Mercer, Reyes, and Cole. The last of them. The ones who had ruled the city with unchecked power, who had destroyed lives without consequence, who had believed themselves invincible. "You should know something," she said, her voice calm, measured, absolute. "Every case you ever touched, every person you ever framed, every lie you ever told," she exhaled, tilting her head. "It's all coming undone." Mercer stiffened. Reyes muttered a curse under his breath. Cole closed his eyes briefly, accepting what they all already knew. This wasn't just the end of their careers. This was the beginning of their reckoning. The air outside the courthouse was thick with tension, the kind that didn't just settle, it clung. The streets, normally buzzing with the usual rhythm of the city, were now suffocated by an energy that felt almost alive, a current of disbelief, fear, and the unmistakable scent of impending chaos. The world had just shifted under the feet of those who had spent decades believing they were untouchable, and the weight of that reality was sinking into every corner of Baton Rouge. The steps leading away from the courthouse were swarmed with reporters, cameras flashing, voices overlapping as journalists fought to get their questions heard, their microphones thrust forward like weapons, their words desperate, urgent, clawing for the first scoop on the scandal that had just detonated in the heart of the city. Inside, the wreckage of that explosion was still settling. The courtroom, which had once been a place where power was wielded like a hammer against those who couldn't fight back, now felt hollow, stripped of its illusions. The judge's bench, once a throne of unchecked authority, was now just a seat, empty, cold, abandoned in disgrace. The jury box, where false justice had been carried out for years, stood vacant. The prosecution's table, where cases had been built on lies, was now nothing more than a piece of furniture, its papers scattered, meaningless, remnants of a reality that no longer existed. The cuffs had clicked shut around the wrists of men who had thought themselves invincible, and now, as the doors slammed behind them, as the final echoes of their fall reverberated through the halls of justice they had corrupted, there was only one truth left standing. They had lost. Jordan Carter had watched them go, had seen the way Mercer had struggled against the hands of the federal agents, the way Reyes had gone pale, his usual arrogance drained from his face, the way Cole had looked down, his silence speaking louder than any defense he could have given. She had seen the way Judge Greaves had gripped the edge of his bench, his knuckles white, his mouth slightly open, as if his brain refused to process what was happening to him, as if even in the final moments of his reign, he still believed there had to be a way out. There wasn't. Not this time. Not anymore. The walls of their world had collapsed around them, but Jordan knew better than anyone that a system as corrupt as this one did not crumble quietly. This was not just about the men who had been arrested today. They had been powerful, yes. They had controlled lives, stolen justice, rewritten truth itself to fit their needs, but they had not done it alone. There were others. There were always others. The architects of this rot, the people who had sat comfortably in the background while men like Mercer and Reyes got their hands dirty, the ones who had funded it, covered it up, whispered in the right ears, made sure the right cases disappeared while others were pushed forward with doctored evidence. They were still out there. Watching. Waiting. Calculating their next move. Jordan knew that the second Mercer had been pulled from that courtroom, the second Reyes had stopped laughing, the second the judge had finally realized he wasn't a god, the machine had already begun shifting, adjusting, preparing its counterattack. This wasn't a war that ended with handcuffs and headlines. This was only the first shot fired. The doors of the courthouse swung open behind her, and she stepped outside into the chaos waiting for her. Reporters surged forward, voices colliding, questions being thrown at her from every direction, their words blending into a blur of sound, indistinct, frantic, desperate for answers. How long had the investigation been happening? Who else was involved? Was the mayor connected? How deep did the corruption go? What would happen now? She didn't answer. She kept walking. The cameras followed. The entire city was watching. She had spent her entire career dismantling lies, uncovering secrets, dragging the truth into the light where it could no longer be ignored. But this truth was bigger than any case she had ever handled. This truth had teeth. It had claws. And it wasn't just going to sit there and let itself be exposed without a fight. She knew what was coming. She had declared war on a system that did not forgive, that did not forget, that did not let its enemies walk away unscathed. And she was ready. Because this time, they were the ones who should be afraid. The weight of everything that had just happened had settled over the city like a storm that had finally broken, leaving behind destruction in its wake but also a strange, almost eerie clarity. The courthouse, once a place where power had been twisted, manipulated, and wielded like a weapon against the innocent, now stood as something else entirely, a battlefield where the untouchable had finally been touched, where justice had clawed its way out of the grave they had tried to bury it in, where men who had spent their lives believing they were the architects of fate had learned, too late, that they were nothing more than pawns in a game they no longer controlled. The streets outside were choked with bodies, reporters shoving microphones forward, cameras flashing so rapidly they painted the air in bursts of white, the noise of the city rising in a frantic, chaotic hum that pulsed like a heartbeat out of rhythm. The people who had been watching from the sidelines, who had spent years knowing the truth but never daring to speak it, were no longer silent. There were voices cutting through the air now, shouting names, demands, declarations of victory in disbelief. Some people were angry, furious that it had taken this long, that so much damage had already been done. Others were stunned, unable to process what they had just witnessed, as if waiting for someone to tell them it had all been a mistake, that the machine of corruption was still intact, still unshaken, that the illusion they had lived under hadn't just shattered in front of them. And then there were those who felt something they hadn't dared to feel in a long, long time, hope. A fragile, tentative thing, curling through the crowd like smoke, unsteady but growing, a slow-burning realization that maybe, just maybe, the rules weren't as unbreakable as they had seemed. That maybe, power didn't belong only to the corrupt. That maybe, this wasn't the end of something, but the beginning of something else entirely. Jordan Carter stood in the middle of it all, the eye of the storm, her breath steady, her pulse strong, her gaze unflinching as she watched the world shift around her. She had spent years unraveling corruption, exposing the dirt that festered beneath polished exteriors, tearing down men who thought themselves untouchable, but this moment was different. This wasn't just another case. This wasn't just another takedown. This was a war, and she had just fired the first real shot. And the people who had built this system, who had benefited from it, who had hidden behind their wealth and their influence while men like Mercer, Reyes, and Greaves did their dirty work. They were watching. She could feel it, the invisible weight of their attention pressing down on her, the way the power players were already recalculating, already deciding whether they would try to salvage what was left or cut their losses and let their foot soldiers rot in prison. She knew how they thought. She had studied them, hunted them, destroyed them one by one. And now, as she stood here, in front of the cameras, the city, the world, she knew without a doubt that somewhere, in some office, behind closed doors, deals were being whispered, plans were being rewritten, strategies were shifting. The machine was adapting, like it always did, like it had been built to do. But so was she. She heard the footsteps before she saw them, the heavy, deliberate march of someone who had spent their entire life walking into dangerous situations with their head held high. Agent Hughes appeared at her side, his presence a steadying force, his gaze scanning the crowd with the trained precision of a man who knew exactly how fast things could spiral out of control. He didn't speak at first, didn't need to, because they both knew what came next. He let out a slow breath, his voice low, meant only for her. They won't stay quiet. Jordan didn't glance at him, didn't break her focus from the sea of faces in front of her, from the cameras that were capturing her every movement, every breath, every flicker of emotion on her face. I know. Hughes shifted slightly, just enough that their shoulders almost touched, his voice carrying something unreadable beneath its usual steadiness. Mercer, Reyes, Cole, they were just the front line. The real power isn't in handcuffs. It's still out there. Jordan exhaled, slow and measured, feeling the weight of everything yet to come settling in her bones. I know. A pause. Then, Hughes' voice dipped even lower. You realize what this means, don't you? He wasn't asking about the arrests. He wasn't asking about the people already scrambling to cover their tracks, to erase their connections to the men now being processed like common criminals. He was asking about what happened next. About the consequences. About the storm that was already building on the horizon. Jordan turned to him then, finally meeting his gaze, her expression unreadable, her voice quiet but carrying more weight than 1,000 shouted accusations. I was never under any illusions about how this would end. Hughes studied her for a long moment, something flickering across his face that was almost hesitation, almost concern, but then it was gone, replaced by the same unwavering resolve that had kept him at her side through all of this. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head, more to himself than to her. You're going to burn the whole damn thing down, aren't you? Jordan's lips barely curved, not quite a smile, but something close, something knowing, something that made the space between them crackle with the weight of inevitability. I'm just getting started. And she was. Because this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The people who thought they could outrun justice, who thought they could rewrite reality to fit their own needs, who believed they were too powerful to fall. They were about to learn exactly how wrong they were. And this time, there would be no place left for them to hide. The weight of the moment had not faded, nor had the tension in the air loosened its grip. The storm that had erupted inside the courthouse had spilled into the streets, into the veins of the city, spreading like wildfire, igniting conversations behind closed doors where men in suits whispered about damage control, about what came next, about how to contain what had already slipped through their fingers. Power never went down quietly, and the people who had built this system, the real architects, the ones who never dirtied their hands, the ones who let men like Mercer and Greaves take the fall while they remained untouched, they were watching, waiting, recalculating. Jordan could feel it. The shift in the air, the way the machine was already twisting, adjusting, preparing its counterattack. The sound of heavy boots echoed against the pavement as Mercer was forced toward a waiting black SUV, the cuffs on his wrists no longer just a symbol of defeat but a reality he could no longer deny. His face was taut with barely concealed rage, his breath coming short, controlled, as if he was still clinging to the belief that this wasn't real, that there was some angle, some escape, some last-minute lifeline that would pull him from this wreckage. But there wasn't. Not this time. Reyes was behind him, his usual smirk wiped clean, his face drawn and pale, his eyes darting around, searching for something, anything, that might mean this wasn't the end. He was used to slipping through cracks, to working behind the scenes, to avoiding the consequences that were now crushing down on him with full force. He turned his head sharply, his voice just low enough to be dangerous. This isn't over. You think you won something today? You think this means anything? You have no idea how deep this goes. Jordan didn't flinch. Didn't blink. She stepped closer, her voice cutting through the air like a blade sharpened on the bones of every case she had worked, every injustice she had uncovered, every truth she had dragged kicking and screaming into the light. You still don't get it, do you? Her gaze locked onto his, unwavering, unshaken, filled with something that wasn't just certainty but something deeper, something final. This isn't about you anymore. This isn't about Mercer, or Greaves, or any of the other men who thought they were untouchable. This is about the people you served, the people you destroyed, the people who finally get to see what justice looks like. You don't get to rewrite this narrative anymore. You don't get to control the outcome. Reyes scoffed, shaking his head, but the flicker of something behind his eyes, fear, recognition, the slow, sinking realization that she was right, was impossible to ignore. Mercer exhaled sharply beside him, the tendons in his neck tightening, his teeth grinding together as he spoke through clenched jaws. You think the people above us are just gonna sit back and let this happen? You think you exposed something new? His lips curled, something bitter and resentful dripping from his words. You're just a pawn in a bigger game, Carter. You always were. Jordan let the silence stretch between them, let them feel the weight of their own insignificance pressing down on them for the first time in their lives. Then she took another step closer, lowering her voice just enough that only Mercer and Reyes could hear, but with a force behind it that made the air between them crackle. Then I guess they should have picked a better opponent. The agent beside her tightened his grip on Mercer's arm, pulling him forward, guiding him toward the SUV that would take him to a place where he would no longer hold any power, where the walls that had protected him for so long would not exist, where his name would no longer carry the weight he had relied on to shield himself from the consequences of his actions. Reyes followed, his face twisted with something that hovered between fury and fear, his breath uneven as he was pushed forward. Cole was already inside the vehicle, his head lowered, his shoulders slumped, silent in a way that spoke volumes. The city was still watching. The cameras were still rolling. The people who had once feared the power of these men were standing tall now, watching them be taken away, their voices rising in the background like a tide that had been held back for too long, voices calling out names, calling out stories, calling out everything that had been silenced until this moment. Jordan turned away from the spectacle, stepping back toward the courthouse, toward Hughes, who was standing just a few feet behind her, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak right away, didn't need to. He just watched her, taking in everything, the way she held herself, the way she didn't exhale like someone who had won, but like someone who knew this was just another battle in a war that had no clear ending. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice low, steady, familiar in a way that reminded her she wasn't alone in this. They're not going to let this stand. The people above them, the ones who let this go on for years, they're already moving. Jordan nodded once, slowly, her eyes scanning the crowd, the faces, the shifting energy of the city that was beginning to understand that this wasn't just a moment. It was a turning point. I know, she said, her voice calm, but beneath it, something sharper, something unyielding. Hughes tilted his head slightly, watching her closely, then let out a slow breath. And you're ready for what comes next? Jordan turned to face him fully, meeting his gaze, her expression unreadable, her resolve unshaken. I've been ready. Because this was not the end. This was only the beginning. The fallout was swift, ruthless, and absolute. The machine of corruption that had operated unchecked for years had finally been exposed, its gears broken apart, its architects dragged into the light where their power meant nothing. The city did not forget, and it certainly did not forgive. The arrests had sent a shockwave through every level of government, through the police force, the judiciary, the very infrastructure that had enabled men like Mercer, Reyes, Cole, and Greaves to rule without fear of consequences. They had played the game for years, believing they were untouchable, believing that no matter how much dirt they buried, no matter how many lives they ruined, the world would continue to turn in their favor. They were wrong. Mercer was the first to fall. His trial was a spectacle in itself, but this time, he wasn't the one holding the power. The testimonies that came forward were damning. Officers who had once stood beside him, fearful of speaking out, now took the stand with evidence, with years of suppressed confessions, with stories that revealed the depth of his brutality. The people he had terrorized, the families he had torn apart, the lives he had treated as disposable, all came forward to make sure the world knew exactly who he was. There was no plea deal, no escape, no loophole waiting for him in the fine print. Life in federal prison. No parole. No reduced sentence. Just a cold, steel cage in a world where the uniform he had once used as a shield meant nothing. Reyes didn't last long in confinement. The moment the reality of his situation settled in, the moment he realized that the power he had clung to was nothing but a ghost, he crumbled. He tried to cut a deal, to name bigger names, but it was too late. No one wanted his information, no one wanted his testimony, because he was the small fish in a pond full of bigger monsters, and now, he was just another inmate with a target on his back. The people he had crossed, the men he had thrown under the bus, the same officers who had once laughed with him as they destroyed lives, had no sympathy for him. The last anyone heard, he had been transferred to a high-security facility in a different state, far from the city where he had built his empire of lies, forgotten, discarded, a cautionary tale of what happened to men who thought they could outrun their sins. Cole, unlike the others, had seen the writing on the wall long before the cuffs had even touched his wrists. He knew there was no way out, no redemption, no escape from the weight of what he had done. But what made him different was that, for the first time, he didn't try to fight it. He pleaded guilty, took responsibility for his crimes, sat in the courtroom with his head down as the sentences were read out. When he was led away, he didn't resist. He didn't scream about injustice or claim he had been set up. He just accepted his fate. And in the end, that was the closest thing to redemption he would ever find. Judge Greaves, the man who had built his throne on the suffering of others, didn't fare much better. His connections, his wealth, his years of influence, all of it disintegrated the moment his corruption was laid bare for the world to see. Every case he had ever ruled on was thrown into question, every judgment he had ever handed down re-examined, torn apart, overturned. The judiciary system he had manipulated turned against him without hesitation, eager to cleanse itself of his stain. He spent months locked in legal battles, trying to claw his way out, but in the end, his own arrogance was his downfall. The same laws he had twisted to suit his needs became the chains that bound him. 25 years behind bars. Disgraced. Forgotten. Another name in a long list of men who had thought they were above the law. And then there was Jordan Carter. The woman they had tried to break. The woman they had framed, humiliated, dragged into court in chains, thinking they had won. But she had not only survived, she had risen. She had torn them down piece by piece, unraveled their empire, exposed the truth they had spent years burying. And she wasn't done. The city watched as she stepped forward, no longer just the woman who had taken down Mercer and his men, but something more. A force. A symbol. A warning to the ones who still thought they could operate in the shadows without consequences. She didn't celebrate. There was no victory lap, no speeches of triumph. Because this was not the end. This was the beginning of something far greater. She returned to her position, not just as an agent, but as a leader. Her name carried more weight now, not because of power, but because of trust. People believed in her. They knew she would not back down, that she would not be silenced, that no matter how deeply corruption tried to sink its claws into the system, she would be there, ready to tear it out. And so the battle continued. Because corruption was not a single man. It was a disease. A system. A machine built to protect itself. But for the first time, the people knew they could fight back. They had seen it happen. They had watched justice be served, not just in words, but in action. And that kind of truth was unstoppable. So now, I turn to you. What do you think power really is? Is it money? Control? The ability to manipulate the system to serve you while others suffer? Or is it something greater? The strength to stand against injustice, to expose the truth even when it's dangerous, even when the odds are against you? What would you have done in Jordan's place? Would you have fought, knowing the risks? Or would you have walked away, let the system remain untouched, let the machine continue to grind people down because it was safer that way? Power is not just held by the corrupt. It is held by those who refuse to accept injustice. It is held by those who fight, who speak out, who stand against what is wrong even when it would be easier to look the other way. And the question is, when the time comes, when the truth is staring you in the face, will you have the courage to act? If this story resonated with you, if you believe in truth, in justice, in the power of standing up for what is right, then subscribe to Tales of Twist. There are more stories to be told, more truths to uncover, more battles to fight. And you won't want to miss what comes next.